Chapter 11. A Message to Caesar. Changing into our rad suits, the whole team proceeded across the big crater to the designated spot to meet up with a rider at the designated safe zone. The team approached a hollowed-out house far to the west of the Phoenix crater, and we changed out of the radiation suits. Looking like no more than a pack of scavers, we waited in the hollow home until nightfall. I was on the lookout when I saw the rider come up on his horse, leading 3 more behind him. Horses were native docile animals to the desert. They were commonly called either horses, rad stallions, or more commonly ponis. Many of these creatures bore the marks of radiation much like ghoulified humans, but retained enough brains to not be hostile. I remember seeing pictures of horses in old books and stuff, but never thought they'd still be around. People out west were under the impression that most old world animals went extinct years ago, but each new environment across the wasteland spawned unique animals or mutants, unknown to less worldly people. When the rider was close enough, Bailey asked what his business was. The rider responded, John Jack would be proud, and we were soon on our way. I never rode a pona before, so I rode on the back of Sykes's, keeping watch for anything potentially hostile. I'd seen people riding ponas before, but never thought of doing so myself. People riding tamed ponas were usually a rare sight, especially in Tucson, so doing that for the first time was very exciting. We rode through the desert quickly, circling around north of Phoenix. The sky was dark, and the lights of Phoenix shined under the starry sky, illuminating a faint green glow from the craters beyond. Under the stars, we rode to the north, where we stopped at a large billboard between the highways. The billboard marked the fork in the roads. Both led north, but the east road diverted. The west road led across Arizona, along an old highway once called I-17, going straight up to the ruins of Flagstaff. The east road led up to Cave Creek, which was nothing but atomic stalker and raider territory. Our mission briefing was very cryptic and didn't make much sense to me, but our objective was Sedona. Sedona was only 30 miles or so from the Legion capital of Flagstaff. According to Mr. Swilling's most recent intel, the Legion expansion covered the whole north, but he mentioned that Sedona was the extent of the Legion's reach. Swilling's agents had been operating in the Legion-occupied north ever since they took Flagstaff in 2256. But I was recruited into the Resistance just in time for this particular mission. Mr. Swilling's reports showed the town of Sedona was only recently taken over by the Legion. Sedona used to be a minor trading post that dealt with the local tribes and even the Legion. But the new occupation and establishment of a Legion garrison caused Mr. Swilling to act. Our mission brief was vague, but on the ride I was given even more details. Link up with Captain Smith and Trader Bill's team to establish Resistance presence in Sedona. That was it. Those were the best details of our objective. I can understand the secrecy, but even then, I was new and had no idea what was going on. At a short rest off the highway, Doc elaborated better for my sake. Our plan was to meet up with the 2 teams near a river in the woods. We were to enter the basement of a nearby saloon, which the Legion was using as a mess hall. From there, our mission was to exit the basement into the mess hall, guns blazing. Then, all 3 teams would regroup at the river and hightail it back to the capital. I thought the plan sounded like suicide, but everyone had this intense look of determination in their eyes, so I didn't dare question it despite my uncertainty. We rode on through the night, and I watched the desert start to turn into hills, plains, and then forests. Soon we turned off the old road after seeing red flags with a golden bull in the center that marked the fact we were in Legion territory. On the outskirts of a wrecked town called Oak Creek, we traveled along the river. 30 minutes later, the sun was just starting to show through the scorched trees and the dock halted. We dismounted, leaving our ponas by the banks of the river, and waited. 10 more minutes later, Trader Bill's team showed up, but not Captain Smith's. Trader Bill's team reported that Captain Smith's team had been captured by a Legion column 2 days ago on their ride in from the east. After some protest from Bailey, Doc reminded her that every agent knows the risk of getting caught. Whole teams weren't generally used within Legion territory, so the loss of 5 agents was a bit of a morale blow. Resistance practice in Legion territory had teams disband to take on separate objectives related to intel. Each member of a Resistance team wasn't made aware of their teammates' objective for security in the event of capture. This particular mission wasn't like the usual ones in Legion territory. Doc Martin's orders were to combine our teams for establishing Resistance presence in Sedona. Regardless of what happened to Captain Smith's team, ours and Trader Bill's started to move out. Slowly marching through the burnt forest, my mind thought about what this mess hall and the objective description of guns blazing really meant. The 10 of us approached our target as the sun shimmered through the sea of dead trees. We reached a clearing and scouted the place out. It was a large wooden building surrounded by foliage and numerous wood structures beyond it. From there, we could hear many voices from the opposite side of it, but the basement entrance facing us only had one exterior guard dressed in crimson. The motionless sentry wore a black ski mask, sunglasses, black combat boots, a dirty black skirt kilt, a crimson-colored tunic, a bulky metal and leather chest protector, and held a spear. Observing the guy made me realize how similar I happened to look after my escape from Agua Caliente. Minus the armor and weapons, I could see why someone might have mistaken me for one of them. Doc Martin began our mission with one shot, putting a bullet through the guy's head with his suppressed .44 repeater. Sykes sprung up and dragged the Legion man's body into the bushes with us. Doc stood up and we all walked to the cellar door inconspicuously to find it surprisingly unlocked. Entering the basement, I started to feel antsy. I had the very real feeling that this was going to be my final few minutes, considering the few mission details I was given, and what I or we were supposed to do on the other side of that cellar. I took the moment to imagine my fairly shit life. Between watching my sister die in my arms, being kicked out of town after town, living isolated from the world in my desert shack, shooting El Tiro de Muerte point blank, and nearly dying at Agua Caliente, I figured this was as good a time as any to die. However, I would have given just about anything to be back at my shack and away from the world. When I snapped back to reality, there I was, on the other side of the cellar with all the resistance members to my left and right, and a room full of shocked legionaries in front of me. I raised the shotgun sights in front of my eyes to focus on a man who looked no older than me. He stood there, shaved-headed with dirt across his face, and a mouth hanging wide open in disbelief. Wearing the tatters of a dark red shirt, a dark brown kilt, and combat boots wrapped in metal plates, time slowed as I gently squeezed the trigger. Reaching across his crimson-clad chest and beginning to draw a rusting machete, the shotgun broke the silence with a clap of thunder, and the man's arm detached from his body. It was fish in a barrel. We fired round after round as the Legion soldiers scrambled to get out of the mess hall. The bodies collapsed in front of the doors, piling up at the entrance and making their brothers outside only able to listen to the massacre inside. The few that charged us with blades drawn were quickly dispatched by our incessant volley of gunfire. When all fell silent and the smoke began to clear, over 24 bodies in nearly identical uniforms littered the mess hall in a mangled mess. The legionaries outside broke the windows beside the corpse-blocked doorway, and we fell back to the basement. Quickly emerging from the way we came, the way out was surprisingly clear, and we sprinted for the river as echoes from our pursuers followed us. Chapter 12. The VIP. We fled from the mountainous, charred forests of northern Arizona, being pursued by the Legion for the first few miles. The footbound legionaries were no match for us when we mounted up, so the way south was clear. I was awake for longer than 48 hours by the point we reached the highway, and as the adrenaline subsided, I really started to feel the effects of exhaustion. The sun was blazing overhead, making the desert radiate a disrupting haze across the southern sands. We charged straight on through the desert, not even seeing a soul the entire way. Despite my fatigue, I was in shock that I was still alive after that mess, and at the fact we didn't even lose a single agent during the event. What we did was a massacre, and I didn't know enough about the Legion to determine if they deserved it. Jack Swilling hated the Legion, and I heard stories about them from my teammates, but I didn't notice anything in those brief moments to justify a massacre. My mind grappled with what I just did, and I tried to trust that my new friends were right. No more than 4 more hours later, in a quick changeover, we were back at the Capitol recuperating. While Doc Martin and Trader Bill were explaining what happened, I joined Bailey in my quarters on the right wing. We did good, is what Doc Martin eventually told us. Despite Captain Smith's whole team getting captured, nobody across all of Phoenix thought that resistance members would be able to slaughter a whole building full of Caesar's legionaries. There were no commendations here despite a job well done for Mr. Swilling and the rest of the agents. I don't know how news like that spreads, but we eventually got word that the people of Phoenix learned what we did. I still tried to grapple with what happened for a while after getting some needed rest. Again, I heard stories of the Legion enslaving towns and tribes and doing all kinds of bad things, but I never saw that during the short massacre. I'm sure the people we slaughtered deserved it, but I couldn't shake the feeling I got from gunning down dozens of guys in red and black uniforms. Most of them weren't even armed. So, reports came in day by day of wasteland news, and our team was still resting from our blitz into Legion territory. I watched over Bailey's shoulders as she reviewed cases of prepper movement across the valley, raider attacks on caravans, super mutant kidnappings north of Tucson, and Legion activities in the far north. For a few days I trained with Sykes and Brutus, or learned more about the wastes from Bailey. Bailey was showing me how to read cryptic reports or messages from field agents when one report in particular stuck out. The report was a kidnapping case, but not by super mutants. It was by preppers up near Hallow Wicks, and distinctively signed Mayor Sillen. Hallow Wicks was an old prepper fortress erected northwest of Phoenix, only weeks after the bombs fell. It was the oldest functioning prepper settlement in Arizona, but the army of inbred halfwits there had been teeter-tottering in their truce with Phoenix for decades. In this case, the preppers didn't believe they were paid their annual tribute by Phoenix, so they began attacking caravans around the same time I fled the Jackson brothers' ranch. However, the preppers at the old Wickenburg fortress got fed up with all the politics and decided to kidnap Phoenix's emissary to the western tribals named Master Walker. He was on a simple caravan walk to the west when the Wickenburg preppers killed his caravan and kidnapped him. Our intel reported that he was being held captive in a cell on the outskirts of town along Route 60 at a fortified outpost near the fortress proper. Mr. Swilling was contacted by Phoenix only 2 days later with orders to retrieve Master Walker. Doc Martin was gone for 2 hours in the left-wing atrium before Brutus told me that our team was spearheading the operation. Once again, I wasn't told of any kind of plan until we were marching across the crater en route towards Hallow Wicks. On the other end of the crater, 2 hours through blasted-out Phoenix, as well as 4 more hours on foot to the valley staging area, we made it. Sitting on a ridge and looking at the distant town of Wickenburg or Hallow Wicks Fortress, we waited until nightfall for the plan. As the sun set on the desert, we stood by and waited while the heat from the day turned into the cold of night. With my binoculars, I took notes of the little facility where our target was being held. The place was a wrecked gas station on the outskirts of town surrounded by shacks and junk walls made of blasted cars, tires, and other junk or desert debris. There were sentries on makeshift towers erected out of scaffolding that overlooked the surroundings, even in the darkening night. In the distant northwest and only a mile or two from the outpost was the fortress of Hallow Wicks. There was no way our little team would be able to infiltrate the outpost without the fortress being alerted, especially if we went guns blazing like in Sedona. We were almost certain that if we moved, the entire Hallow Wicks garrison would be on top of us in less than an hour. That was only if we breached the outpost alone. The sky was dark, but before all the light disappeared, I must have counted at least 30 preppers wandering the outpost grounds. Before I could even consider how the doc planned to execute the mission, I heard an unfamiliar deep and crackling voice come from right behind me say, "Don't be alarmed, Agent." I whipped around startled and almost fell off the ridge. Lording over me was a man clad in old-world army bottoms, a combat chest protector scratched to oblivion, and armored pauldrons with red crosses on them. Under his old army helmet, I noticed it wasn't a man, it was a ghoul. The radiation took its toll on his skin over the years because his face was half skull. I looked around to see more men in old military gear talking with the other agents when the ghoul said, "Follow me. Name's Quinn Andrews, by the way. Field medic, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant." Chapter 13, The Hanged Man. Being confused but accepting the ghoul's friendly nature, I silently stood up and walked with the ghoul to the rest of the team. Everyone halted their hushed conversations and gathered around Quinn, who was faintly illuminated by only a few soldiers' glowing cigarettes. I studied the faces of the pre-war army-dressed people and noticed half of them were ghouls, and the other were normal humans. As the smell of burning tobacco filled the air around us, Quinn began. "Good to see you guys again. It's been a while since I got to work with you resistance types." Doc Martin said, "Good to see you too, Quinn. What's the plan? We got our orders, but you got more teams with you?" The old ghoul responded, "Yeah, we got 2 teams in the desert by the highway to the fortress and they're standing by. You agents are leading the extraction team, so the plan is this. At dawn, 2 of my sharpshooters will take up positions and wipe out the inbreds in the towers, while the rest of us flank the south and north sides of the outpost. We can't risk a frontal assault if we want Master Walker alive. So, my guys will plant charges on the flanks, then we blast away and it'll be fish in a barrel. You guys have some experience with that sort of thing from what I understand, ha ha ha. I heard about the mess you guys made up near Sedona. Some of the soldiers chuckled quietly, but me and the doc's team stayed silent as Bailey asked, "Well, what about the explosions? That'll surely get the attention of the fortress, and we'll be up to our asses in prepper hicks in no time." Quinn said, "Don't worry about that. My teams in the desert are going to be pinning down the fortress garrison after those explosions go off. So we'll only have about 5 to 10 minutes before my boys have to fall back. Once inside, secure Master Walker. He should be somewhere in the gas station. I don't have his exact location, but it's a pretty small place. Just be sure to check your corners. We need to snag Master Walker and fall back as quickly as we can. Me and my team here will ensure his safety back in Phoenix, but then I have to meet up with my distraction teams back at the AFB. Sound good?" Doc Martin and Bailey nodded in agreement, and the doc gathered us up while Quinn's group of soldiers got ready for some shut-eye. Doc Martin, Bailey, and Sykes were going to storm the gas station from the northern breach with Quinn, while Brutus and I joined the southern breaching team to pacify the outpost and prevent anyone from coming in after the rescue team. Doc and Bailey weren't sure how I was in a hostage situation and didn't see this as a good teaching moment, so Brutus and I were given the simpler task. I'm sure Brutus was good for this type of thing, but his large LMG wasn't ideal for the close quarters of a tiny gas station. So our team had their positions, and I rolled out my sleeping bag for a few hours before my next big mission. By the time the sun began to rise over the mountains, we were in position. The tower guards had just been eliminated by the sharpshooters without alerting the outpost, and some ghoulish corporal mounted a block of C4 to the junk wall that marked the southern breaching point. Me, Brutus, and 6 other soldiers moved to safety, hearing the voices of preppers on the other side of the wall. The corporal said into his radio, "Ready to detonate when you are." I heard a static. 3, 2, 1. Boom. The wall blew open, sending wooden shrapnel everywhere. We heard another loud boom on the north side, and our team ran through the smoke. The preppers on the other side were confused and disoriented. Some didn't even have weapons, but that didn't stop us from ripping them apart. We fired upon everyone that wasn't an agent or wearing U.S. Army gear. I saw the other team storm the gas station while we fired upon the terrified few still standing. Just then, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was a man hanging from a makeshift gallows. He wasn't hanging by the neck and wasn't wearing a gray suit like our intel described Master Walker. Instead, the man was hung by his arms and wore a tattered green jumpsuit with a blue cross on the back. I ran over to the man and began to cut him down despite the corporal shouting, "What are you doing?" I cut down the man and threw him over my shoulder. Just then, I saw the team escorting what looked like Master Walker out of the gas station, followed by a string of automatic gunfire. Everyone started to sprint out the main entrance, and Quinn shouted over a hail of gunfire, "Who is that?" "Doesn't matter. Get him out. Let's go." The whole team stayed together as we ran into the desert away from Hallowix. The outpost occupants were slaughtered, but Quinn's distraction teams prevented the fortress's garrison from trailing us. We moved through the desert and eventually the ruined suburbs of Outer Phoenix until the sound of gunfire was just an echo in the distance. Chapter 14. A courier named Josh. We slowed down after a few miles and rested in one of the burnt-out houses in Outer Phoenix. We gathered for a collective breath in the living room, and I was finally able to set down the man I saved. The guy was conscious, but just barely. Clearly, he had gone a few days without food and very little water. His body showed signs of torture and winced in pain as he struggled to see where he was or what happened. I handed the man a bottle of water, but he was still too weak to talk or even hold the thing. I poured some of the water into his mouth. He struggled to take it in as his eyes slowly closed and his body went limp. I thought he might have died, but his chest was raising and lowering while weak air came from his mouth. I watched over the man as Quinn did a head count. Doc Martin saw to Master Walker, and Bailey took a seat next to me. The hanged man's eyes quivered slightly when she asked, "Who's this guy?" I replied, still looking at the strange man, "I have no idea." She asked a different question. "Why'd you cut him down?" "He could be a prepper," I replied. "He needed help, and I don't think preppers would hang their own, at least not the way he was. The guy could be a survivor from Master Walker's caravan." She stood up from the torn couch seat and said, "You got a point there. Check his pockets, see what he has." There didn't seem to be anything in his pockets until I found a little balled-up piece of paper. Opening it up, there was a message that simply read, "Josh Courier, 2 Sunpost Exchange." I showed her the message and said, "Looks like the guy's a courier from down in Tucson." She studied the simple message and replied, Okay, we'll take him to Phoenix with us, and who knows? Maybe he'll want to join us after coming to his heroic rescue, haha. Let's get out of here. Preppers are bound to trail us till we reach Phoenix proper. Within a few minutes, I slung the hanged man over my shoulders again and followed the team with Master Walker back to Phoenix. It was exhausting carrying that guy and all the gear I had. Luckily, I had a nice team, and Brutus offered help saying, "Let me help you out, Drifter. It's still a way to town." So I carried the hanged man for most of the time but got relief when I needed some more strength. A few hours later, we reached the outskirts of post-war Phoenix and joined some caravan traffic. We were finally safe from the preppers. We walked towards the gate, and Quinn told us that he had to go back to the base and regroup with the distraction teams. So he took his soldiers with him and left. I told the doc that I was going to stay with the hanged man while the rest of them escorted Master Walker to his home inside the city. Doc said, "Okay, just don't be too long. We'll see you back home when you get a chance." I walked with the hanged man still on my shoulders over to a caravan resting place close to the Phoenix gate. After I paid the weird little man in charge 10 caps, he told me which tent was mine. I dragged the man to a little burlap tent and set him on the sleeping bag while I sat on the little wooden stool to collect myself. About 30 minutes later, I saw the man's eyes begin to open while I cleaned my shotgun. I remained quiet and simply watched as he weakly looked around. He sat up on the sleeping bag, rubbing his wounds, and asked in a deep, stern, and direct way, "Where am I?" Setting down my dismantled shotgun, I replied, "You're just outside Phoenix. Me and my crew saved you from the fortress at Hallowix." He said, "So the resistance saved me?" I answered quickly, "I never said that. Some of my friends are in a merc group and we were hired to take care of Master Walker." He let out a sort of laugh. "It's okay. I don't care that you're a resistance fighter. In fact, I admire you guys for saving me alongside your intended, very important person." He put a strange amount of emphasis on the word intended. I looked to the side. "Yeah, about that. My team didn't want me to cut you down. At least the army guys we were with didn't." He gave another short laugh and asked inquisitively, "So it was an act of heroism on your part?" I finished putting my gun back together and looked up saying, "Not exactly. I just saw someone who needed help and I seized the moment." He remained silent and awaiting something else when I asked, "Why was a courier like yourself being tortured by preppers anyway?" He looked at me puzzled for a second and then said, "Oh, I was carrying correspondence up to a small village north of Hallowix when preppers attacked the party I was with. I guess a few days later they captured Master Walker of Phoenix." I said simply, "Oh, okay." I set my gun beside me and noticed his studying gaze that curiously and seriously scanned my body. Before I could ask, "Why are you staring at me?" his eyes met mine and he said, "You know, I admire your tenacity. You didn't have to save me, but you did. You said it yourself. You saw the moment and you took it despite who I might have been." I shrugged. "Well, like I said, I saw you needed help and I helped. All there is to it." He gave another grin. "All there is to it. I like that." There was another awkward silence and he said, "You know, you and I are in very similar trades." I let out an audible scoff and asked half seriously, "Is that so?" He grinned and rubbed his battered leg while he grabbed my nearby canteen for a swig. "Yes, you fight to secure the wasteland from hostiles, whether they be mutants, raiders, tribals, or preppers, all in the name of bringing civilization to the desert." I was about to interject, but he saw the words on my lips and shot in. "Oh, right. You don't do what you do for civilization. You and your mercenary friends do it for the reward." I stared at the man, waiting for some kind of point when he added, "Regardless of what you do, it has been a struggle to create civilization, ever since humanity found this desert of God's disregard." Confused by the guy's apparent rambling, I asked, "Well, how are you so similar then?" He set the water down. "There is a lot more to being a courier than delivering mail. The act itself is seen as nothing more than walking from place to place and dropping off what is desired, but it stands for something far greater." He paused and studied me intently again for a moment. Ever since mankind nearly ended itself with nuclear bombs, civilization has been practically non-existent in this wasteland. Mutated monstrosities, raiders, homesteaders, preppers, and disgusting tribals have been locked in a never-ending conflict amongst themselves. But man can rise again. There is a way of unifying the people towards one direction that benefits humanity and doesn't hinder it. Deeply considering why I decided to rescue this weirdo, I found solace in the idea of my good deed of the day and answered the last part of his rambling with, "And what way is that?" Without hesitation, he said, "Communication is key for organized society to prosper. Someone as plain as a mailman is linking two places of civility together through the simple prospect of the written word. It might sound crazy, but being able to communicate and coordinate over great distances can do wonders for the world and tilt civilization toward a state that is better able to handle the perils bestowed upon it by God and man itself. Call it wasteland unification. Of course, this only applies if people are communicating for the benefit of mankind itself, rather than personal motivation or self-interest." Somewhat perplexed by the strange mailman's words, I said, "Well, I never thought about it that way." He let out a tremendous laugh. The mailman's deep voice and strange laugh sounded like he hadn't laughed or smiled in his entire life. But as his laugh died, he went on with, "You know, I like you, Drifter. I believe I heard the other Resistance members call you that." I was about to correct him by denouncing my affiliation with them, but the idea seemed fruitless, and he continued, "You should meet me at the old Red Rocket Station just off the West Highway I-17 North in 3 days. I have an offer for you that you might like. I do advise that you come by yourself. I understand how suspicious this may sound, but I urge you to hear me out, and I owe you for saving my life." I was puzzled by the sudden plans he offered me, but I managed to say, "Okay, I'll see you there if I have time, I guess." Then, he stood up from the bedroll as if the past few days of torture and dehydration hadn't happened and crawled out of the tent. He leaned in through the flaps and said, "Find yourself in Scottsdale sometime. It could benefit you." I sat there in confusion for a moment. The man seemed to be knocking on death's door only a short time ago, but sprung up and departed in an instant after that strange conversation. All the more puzzling to me was that he ended our encounter by giving me extremely vague plans. I stood up and exited the tent after briefly going over the encounter in my head. Entering the busy streets of the Phoenix outskirts, I couldn't see Josh anywhere. Before me was a sea of people going about their business in the dark atmosphere of the late evening. Even though the night was young, I knew I'd never be able to find Josh and headed towards the Phoenix Gate. Chapter 15, Do I Know You? I made my way into the city and went through the covert butcher shop on my way to the Capitol in a radiation suit. I followed the trail that the Doc and I took on that first day. The ruins of Phoenix were black, but the full moon above illuminated the way forward over the bricks and debris. Through hollowed-out buildings and over piles of wrecked cars, I walked hearing the howl of irradiated coyotes in the distance and watching the silhouettes of feral ghouls. I stayed quiet, climbing down into the crater and walking the trail up to the sentries on the Capitol doorstep. Inside, I was greeted by the other agents who were planning out their next objectives under the rotunda. I made my way up the grand stairs of the right wing and into my quarters where Brutus and Sykes slept. I took off all my gear and passed out while reflecting on the dangerous day that ended so strangely. I drifted to sleep, but woke up to the feeling of something heavy and light peering in through the windows. I opened my eyes and saw Bailey sitting on top of me, looking down with a smile. She said in a bizarrely adoring way, "Good morning, sleepyhead." I looked at her confused as to what brought this on and said, "Good morning to you?" She asked cheerily, "So, what was that hanged man's deal?" I said, not trying to sound defensive, "What are you talking about? There was no deal?" I looked to see if we were alone, and we were in fact the only two in the room. Still weirdly smiley, she said, "Okay, I just meant to ask what he was like. I saw you take him into that tent. Some of us were curious about why was he at Hallow Wicks." I asked her, "You saw the note, right? He was just a courier who got into some trouble, overall good guy." She cocked an eyebrow. "Is that so?" I responded as honestly as I could, "Yep, just a simple courier. Although one who takes delivering mail a little too seriously if you ask me." I let out a weak laugh while she stared down at my face. She raised an eyebrow again and asked, "Well, where is he now?" Doc was interested in questioning him, maybe seeing if he wanted to help us out in some way. "We can always use another set of eyes in the desert." I said, "He headed out and I lost track of him, probably went back to Tucson. The guy seemed like he was all business." A slight look of anger or disappointment appeared on her face as she said, "Next time, don't let people we rescue go. We can use anybody potentially useful, especially down south, and even more so after losing Captain Smith's team." She studied me again for a solid minute, then continued, "Anyway, Doc is having you, me, and Sykes go into Phoenix for ammunition and weapons from our contact. We lost a lot of good equipment when Captain Smith's team got captured, and our rewards from rescuing Master Walker got us the funds to replace everything. So, get dressed. She got off me and left the room to change over. She was only wearing her underwear? As I got dressed, I wondered about the strange attitude she had and the oddly seductive nature of that interrogation. I wondered if she was trying to coax something out of me, but I was as honest as I thought I was. It was just then that I remembered how the weirdo mailman asked me to meet him north of Phoenix in a few days. I shrugged it off and thought, I'll mention it to her when we get back from Phoenix. Not like I'm even gonna go to that meeting. After I was changed over, Bailey and Sykes knocked on the door and we headed downstairs to the rotunda. We put on our radiation suits and headed into the ruins back to Phoenix. Back at the butcher shop, we took off our suits and entered the crowd. We walked through the streets. I never really noticed all the poor and helpless here. I never really saw Phoenix during the day aside from that first time. But I was too puzzled by Doc Martin springing me from jail and taking in the new city to notice any of the scum. The poor and destitute flooded the street corners asking for handouts from merchants going shop to shop. Phoenix guards in ragtag metal and leather gear patrolled the main roads, and I even saw some of them shooting up with the corner junkies. I observed a group of a dozen tribals covered in dirt and blood getting searched by the guards at one of the side gates. Sykes saw me studying the tribals and said, "Refugees, likely from a Legion attack. We give them shelter here in Phoenix. In exchange, they are placed in households as servants and given quarters in the commons houses." I couldn't believe how many beggars and junkies there were. Towns out in California had them, and Tucson was no exception, but here they were everywhere. It was then that I thought back to the stuff Bailey told me about Phoenix's history and wondered what Phoenix produced. Towns down south got by on scavenging or farming from scratch-built irrigation systems, but the only thing Phoenix offered was water from the Colorado Reservoir. Phoenix had ranches outside town, water workers, caravans, shops, blacksmiths, and scav companies. But during this walk, I noticed the urban structure of post-war Phoenix largely consisted of nothing more than beggars, chem fiends, and war-weary refugees. I stopped looking down at the surplus of disenfranchised wastelanders when I noticed a sign we passed. The makeshift sign said, "Scottsdale Gate 1 mile." Then I remembered that strange courier, Josh, or whatever his name was, saying to find myself in Scottsdale if I had the chance. As soon as I remembered that, we found our contact. In an alley behind a brothel stood a man in rags who wore heavy metal plates on top of it. He had two goons next to him standing by a broken-down car carrying heavy machine guns, and a nearby Brahmin ready to be loaded up with goods. I stood by while Bailey did the talking, and Sykes opened the busted trunk of the car, pulling out several ammo cans. Sykes placed a few rifles next to the ammo cans, and the deal was almost over. After handing him the caps, Bailey started to load the ammo cans into the trunk strapped to a Brahmin. I helped them load up, and Bailey led our new Brahmin out of the alley and back down the roadway we came. We walked through the streets back towards the butcher when I saw a man approach us from the front. He almost appeared to glow based on how different he looked compared to the sea of squatters and wastelanders going about their business around him. The man wore a clean striped suit, light blue with thick black lines going vertical, and a pair of large dark sunglasses that covered the upper half of his face. I already said it, but the man was very out of place for Phoenix. I wondered where he was going as he got closer. The man stopped, and although I couldn't see his eyes through the reflective shades, the fact he stood a few yards from me made it clear that I was his target. The strange guy stared intently at me for a few awkward seconds and shouted, "Oh my word, I can't believe it's actually you." He jogged a little closer and threw his arms around me. Before I could ask what was happening, the strange flashy man whispered in my ear, "Go along with it." Bailey and Sykes were as confused as I was while they watched silently. I felt the man's tight embrace and said, "I can't believe it's actually you too." The man immediately shouted aloud for all to hear, "I can't believe you are alive. I heard about that fix you got into at Agua Caliente. We have to catch up." Instinctively trying my hardest to sound natural, I said, "Right, I remember you. Crazy business over there, barely got out in one piece." Looking at Bailey and Sykes, he gave me a sharp nudge. "Look at you, man, back up and at it again? Got yourself in with a caravan crew, did you? Ha ha!" He wrapped his arms around me again and shouted, "I can't believe you are okay." Then whispered again, "Separate yourself from them, trust me, a friend awaits you." I looked at my team, and the man released his embrace. I said, "Hey guys, is it alright if I meet up with y'all a bit later? I have to catch up with my old buddy here." They stared at me blankly for a second, and Bailey said, "Yeah, it's fine, I guess. Richard and I got it from here." I said, "Okay, see ya Richard, see ya Lauren." I walked off with the strange flashy man while Bailey and Sykes walked away. I wondered if Bailey and Sykes were following me or suspicious about my relations to the well-dressed stranger. Then I realized that I was probably even more suspicious, and strangely heading east towards the Scottsdale gate. When I stole a look behind, I noticed the duo had disappeared into the crowds, but I saw the trunks from the back of our Brahmin still moving in the opposite direction. I then looked at the man who remained silent the whole time and asked, "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" He stayed quiet for a second, then said sternly while looking forward, "Tom Kekos, that's my name. I'm in the employment of a man who is interested in you and your contacts. I have been ordered to take you and you alone to him in Scottsdale." I asked, "Who is this guy? What does this guy want?" Then added, "If you try anything funny, I'll blast you to pieces." I racked my shotgun to show I was serious, and without flinching he said, "That won't be necessary. Just do what you're told and remain pleasant. As pleasant as you wastrels can be, at least. Scottsdale doesn't enjoy associating with the people of Phoenix, but will if an individual is in high enough regard, which I am told you are." Chapter 16, Scottsdale. We reached a large concrete and steel gate that had automated turrets overlooking this part of East Phoenix. There were guards all over, and we approached the entry officer who was dressed head to toe in black ballistic plates and had a golden emblem of an S with a wreath around it in the center of the chest plate. Behind the clear visor of a riot helmet, the scowling officer said, "Business in Scottsdale?" Mr. Kekos showed him a piece of paper, and the officer said, "Welcome back to Scottsdale, Mr. Kekos. Is this wastrel with you?" Mr. Kekos nodded, and the gate opened into Scottsdale. Mr. Kekos said, "Welcome to Old Town Scottsdale, and like I said, remain pleasant." The city was amazing. There were tall buildings colored bright shades of the spectrum, non-burned palm trees lined the roads, the streets were freshly paved, and there were fountains on every street corner. We walked past little parks with green grass, kids in clean suits or dresses played, and the people were all beautiful. The women wore sundresses, and the men wore clean suits like Mr. Kekos. Each suit or dress was a different bright color. Servants wore all white and brought people walking the streets bottles of water or preserved fruits. It was like I stepped into a time machine and went back to before the bombs fell. Scottsdale appeared to not even have been touched by the warheads that scorched the earth. We reached a giant building that was far bigger than anything I'd ever seen, with hundreds of people walking into or around it. Mr. Kekos noticed my dumbstruck face and said, "That is the mall." Pre-war, it was a center of commerce, but now it is primarily the seat of our city's authority. High-level merchants on the ground and second floor, and politics on the third. I was stunned. This city was unlike anything I thought existed. As I looked around in shock, I caught Mr. Kekos' expression that seemed boastful even behind those giant sunglasses. It was hard to believe that broken-down squatter town Phoenix was only a half-mile to the west. Walking on, we passed the mall and walked over a small canal to the south known as the waterfront. We approached a collection of pristine, multi-storied buildings with many balconies strewn in green plants. Atop the balconies were even more clean-dressed men and women smoking, drinking, and socializing. We passed the classy domiciles and entered the lobby of a tall building emblazoned in giant gold letters saying it was called the Bridgeton Towers. I was in awe yet again. It was as if the bombs never fell. The lobby was brightly illuminated by huge chandeliers, and I still couldn't get over how beautiful everyone looked. I noticed some of the servants were ghouls, and even they looked pretty good too. They must have had some excellent makeup artists in this place to fix the faces of those poor irradiated saps. We walked to the far end of the lobby where another black and gold guard stood by an elevator. As we approached, the guard opened it and said, "Welcome back, Mr. Kekos. Boss is waiting." Before entering the elevator, Mr. Kekos said to me, "Please hand over all your weapons to the security gentleman here." I was hesitant, but the guard dressed in all black ballistic steel leered at me through the clear visor on his helmet. After handing over my shotgun, the guard took extra precautions by patting me down and even confiscating my dull utility knife still stained by Gilbert Jackson. Unarmed and at the mercy of Mr. Kekos' employer, we entered the elevator and rode it up many stories before reaching the penthouse floor. Chapter 17, Spoiled little rich kid. The elevator doors opened smoothly, exposing a gorgeous penthouse with glass walls overlooking the Phoenix ruins to the south. Some of the glass was cracked, but this place appeared to be yet another time capsule. Atop a white balcony overlooking the elevator and living room, I saw a man come inside through the glass door to the patio overlook. The guy was only wearing some sweatpants and a smile. His tan skin and bright smile peered right through us as he shouted, "Welcome, come on up, guys." Mr. Kekos and I headed up the stairs and found the mystery man getting dressed at the edge of a large clean bed with beautiful naked women lying around him. The mystery man said, "Go on, get out of here, girls. I got business to take care of." The stranger gave me and my escort another face-breaking smile. The girls didn't even bother to get dressed as they just headed past us downstairs to the living room. Mr. Kekos and I stood idly and awkwardly for a moment until the guy said, "Come on, fellas, make yourselves comfortable on the patio while I get dressed." Mr. Kekos and I opened the sliding glass door to the patio, and he sat down at a lawn table while I was dumbstruck at the view of the ruins. I was surprised I didn't notice this tower earlier. We must have been 15 or 20 stories up. The patio overlook showed the Caesar Valley ruins going south as far as the eye could see. Then I looked off the west end to see the Wall of Phoenix and the broken-down urban scrap city of post-war Phoenix. I heard the door open again, and the mystery man was wearing a pure white suit unspeckled by any dust or debris. The man stood there with his dark brown hair slicked over to the side and that giant pristine smile to match his suit with little circular sunglasses that seemed to only cover his eyes. He extended his hand for a handshake and said enthusiastically, "What a shithole, right? Look at all that devastation." I shook his hand and he continued, "Nice to meet you. I heard, enough about you. Anyway, welcome. I am Marcus Dinero, Chief Ambassador for the city of Scottsdale, but far more than that I dare say, ha. I'm something of a Renaissance man if I do say so myself. Ha. But, since you were gracious enough to answer my call, and you seem like a cool kitty cat, you can call me Mark. Come on, let's take a seat." Ignoring the guy's weird introduction, we both took seats at the lawn table high above the wasteland while Mr. Kekos stood to lean on the railing directly behind me. I studied Mark's face and clearly younger complexion. The more I studied the man's overall appearance and bizarrely large grin, the less I thought about my discomfort and lack of defense. The guy patiently sat there smiling at me through his tiny circular sunglasses. I finally asked the first thing that came to mind, "How old are you? And why did you want to speak with me?" "I'm just a drifter floating through Phoenix." His grin stretched somehow even wider before he blurted out, "I'm so glad you noticed my younger complexion. I do work hard to maintain my flawless features. Haha. I turned 19 last week, but was granted the illustrious title of Chief Ambassador for my father, who passed several months ago due to a raging infection of the, Never mind. I have been working for the people of Scottsdale since I was 12 years old. But, to answer your other question, I know of you through our mutual partner, Mr. Joshua. He said you were playing a dangerous game working with those resistance silly boys and all, haha. Not even trying to protect my covert allegiance anymore, I blatantly asked, "How do people just happen to know I'm with Swilling's resistance?" Joshua sniffed it out of me, "And I suppose you too." He smiled brightly and interrupted me. "Because you don't wear that badge like the other agents do. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Could you imagine? A covert militant organization that wears badges? That wouldn't work out one bit, ha. Anyway, your loyalties aren't to them. So you radiate a presence of non-belonging, but I do know the other side you're working." He then gave me a silly but sly intentioned wink that was still obvious behind his sunglasses. I shook my head and responded sincerely, "Then you should probably tell me what I'm doing. People tend to know more about me than I do myself." He tilted his head forward, giving me an overly scheming look. "Oh, you little sneak, haha. You're a messenger from Joshua. Don't pretend I don't know, buddy boy." He gave me another wink. I said right to his face, "I swear to you I am not." Still smiling, he said, "Like it or not, intentional or not, you are. Hell, you wouldn't be here right now if that wasn't the case, ha. Anywho, Joshua sees something in you that could benefit him, and me coincidentally. All I have to say is, I want in." I was nearly shouting at this point. "I am not working for him, Mr. Dinero. Why would I even want to work with that? Courier? I guess he's connected, or something. But I ain't doing stuff for him." A look of disbelief appeared on his face, and after a brief moment of silence, he said, "You really think that guy's just a courier? He paused and I remained tense before he added, "Can I ask you something?" Calming down, I responded, "Yeah, and okay?" He continued, "What do you think of Scottsdale, honestly?" Still somewhat frustrated, I answered his question, "It's amazing. I've never even heard of a settlement this clean or fancy. Why?" He laughed lightly. "Ha ha, I can see that from an outsider's perspective. I love this city and lived here my whole life, but it is dying." He caught my attention with that last part. Dying? How? He stole a glance off to the north, in the same way Doc Martin did when he explained Phoenix's supposed impending doom. There is a growing monstrosity to the north that will devastate the whole Sonoran wasteland and take my beloved Scottsdale with it. He paused and looked back in my direction, saying, "I don't give a shit about those squatters over in Phoenix, but I know Scottsdale is already lost. As much as I love Scottsdale and all it stands for is the pinnacle of excellence, I love myself more." He looked me dead in the eye and said in a way that somehow sent me chills, "I am not going down with it." I was shocked by the way he said those last words and absent-mindedly wondered what he was talking about before it hit me. "You're talking about the Legion, right? That big war tribe to the north?" He leaned back and smiled. "Precisely." I asked, "So what do you want from me?" He stood up to make a drink over at the little mixing station he had in the corner of the patio. I said earlier that I want in. I have been exchanging correspondence with an agent of Joshua. I don't know who Joshua is or what he does exactly, but he is most definitely involved with the Legion, and definitely not just a messenger. Sitting back down, he said, "You are looking at the Legion's inside man, ha ha." I asked again, "What does this have to do with me?" "I'm not the agent, and I'm not with the Legion. I only met the guy once." He said, "I know that you have a meeting with him scheduled in 2 days." He waited for me to say something but continued after I gave no response. "I want to meet the face behind those letters I've been getting." I said as plainly as possible, "I would love for you to meet the guy with me, but I don't even think I'm going." Also, he said to come alone. His default bright smile turned into a sinister scowl. Even through his bizarre choice of words and upbeat tone of voice, I could tell he was deadly serious as he replied sharply, "I hope you are just telling me a jolly. I need you to go to that meeting and to take me with you. And it won't matter when he sees that you brought me because he told you to find yourself in my city, which you did, you goofy boy. Finally, you know way too much for you to just walk out that door. I'm afraid you have to do this. I'm sorry it has to be this way. I think you are the cat's meow, I really do. But you need to do this for me. Who knows? You might even like what he has to say." When he was done, I sat there silently for a moment. I didn't know what to say. So I just spoke honestly and almost pleaded for some sort of conclusion by saying, "I don't know. I never asked for any of this." Reaching across the table, he awkwardly gave me a little punch on the shoulder with that sly, smiley look on his face. I just sat there quietly while he genuinely and sympathetically said, "Cheer up, pal. This'll be cool. I promise it will. After all, you're with your buddy Mark, and Mr. Kekos, of course." Aha. I glanced up from my clouded mind to see the socialite's penetratingly white teeth and eyes covered by tiny reflective shades. Giving me another strange punch, he caught my easing expression and said, "I'm serious with this. After the meeting, you are free to go, and you can do whatever you want in the whole wide world. But right now, I'll ask you like a friend. Will you do this for me?" I sighed, but returned a pseudo-smile through my teeth to match his. "I guess I don't really have much choice." He immediately cheered with the enthusiasm of a child. "Oh, wonderful. Simply excellent. Mr. Kekos, go make up the guest room and present the girls for his pick. Unless you're into guys, are you? We'll figure all that out later." Aha. In any event, all hints of even the tiniest bit of seriousness in his face vanished in the blink of an eye, and his childlike grin shined at me brighter and wider than ever as he continued his cheer. "This is so great! I haven't had a buddy sleepover in a long time. Except for Mr. Kekos here, ha ha, but he doesn't count. Also, I'm sure you understand that I can't let you contact those resistance hooligans while you're here. Can't have them beating down my door to come and get you. Ha ha ha. So, you will live here in my penthouse for the next day and a half, then we'll ride out to where good old Joshua told you to meet him." He stood up and went back inside the penthouse, leaving me alone on the balcony. Before the sliding glass door completely shut, Mr. Dinero's distant voice shouted, "This is so great. Ha ha ha. I was frustrated at this whole ordeal. I didn't like the idea of being stuck in that penthouse despite how glamorous it was. I sat there alone on the balcony for several minutes just contemplating everything that got me where I was and trying to consider how to escape everything. Only a few weeks ago, none of this mattered to me, not the Resistance, Bailey, Phoenix, Legion, Joshua, or anything. I was very quickly starting to long for the days of idle nothingness at my shack in the wildlife preserve. Sitting there, I began planning a way to escape the Resistance and how to get as far away from any human beings as possible. However, none of those plans were possible or even mattered at the moment. I was stuck. Mr. Kekos and Mr. Dinero's guards wouldn't let me into the elevator, or I'd be killed for what I knew. The teenage ambassador didn't have to say it, but I knew what would happen if I tried to execute an escape, even if he was too young and polite to tell me. So I eventually concluded that I wasn't going anywhere, at least until that meeting. Might as well make the best of it. Later that night, I sat down with Mr. Dinero in his living room and had a couple of drinks with the guy. I was initially very reserved, but the more drinks brought over to us, the more I loosened up. At one point, I drunkenly told him that he could just go in my place so I wouldn't have to be involved. He explained that if Joshua saw himself ride up alone and with the knowledge of the meeting place, he himself would likely be gunned down. He kept saying that nothing good could come from infiltrating the meeting solo that was supposed to be between Joshua and I. That didn't sound like the best of reasons, but being buzzed made me more agreeable. It was also difficult to protest my situation on the most comfortable couch I'd ever sat on, influenced by the smoothest liquor, while two incredibly beautiful, scantily dressed women gave me something called a massage. The two of us talked well into the night about a lot I don't even remember, but I do recall the strange vibe I got from the man. Mr. Dinero tried everything he could to be my buddy or pal that evening, but even in an intoxicated state, it came off a little desperate. I remember him explaining that he didn't have time for friends as the chief ambassador for Scottsdale. When he did have free time, he would lounge around his penthouse having sex with his 7 girlfriends, drinking liquor, or shooting off the patio into the wasteland. It seemed like he was just a lonely young kid who had a little too much power and was playing with something he didn't fully understand. But to be fair, I didn't understand what I was getting into either. Chapter 18. Life of the Socialite. That night of socializing with my captor/buddy eventually ended, and he sent an adorable late-teen blonde girl to the guest room for me. His goal was for me to get, as he put it, acquainted with her. I let the girl into the room, but I must have let down every single man in the wasteland by not sleeping with her. I actually did sleep with her, but didn't feel the urge to satisfy her the way Mark was obviously hoping. The idea of sleeping with that innocent and naive escort just felt like a bribe. However, I did end up talking to her for a bit before passing out from the liquor. It turned out her actual name was Ashlyn, but she went by Amethyst for all of Scottsdale's elite. The next morning, Ashlyn left the room, and I joined Mark and his girls for a breakfast prepared by the many servants. Mark offered me a fine pre-war suit to exchange for my rugged pants, worn-out boots, and fraying skaver jacket. I declined, telling him that if he and I were going to ride out into the wastes next afternoon, a suit would be very impractical. He agreed with more enthusiasm than I expected, took my advice, and sent Mr. Kekos into Scottsdale saying, "I want to dress like a rugged wasteland warrior too." Mr. Kekos came back a few hours later with a trunk that had a large assortment of wasteland or survivalist equipment. After that, I was forced to spend the next 2 hours helping my new buddy try on different articles of clothing and equipment. Mr. Dinero ended up choosing the most ridiculous outfit of what looked like an old medieval suit of armor on top of a tan and green checkered pre-war suit. He attempted to explain that the tan and green suit was for camouflage, despite the glimmering steel plates on top. Mr. Dinero looked absolutely ridiculous, but there was something strangely heartwarming about how ecstatic he was for the whole ordeal. Since the man took all the stupidest equipment from the gear pile, I was able to take some of the more practical pieces for myself. I grabbed an old military combat vest out of the trunk and exchanged it for my leather bandolier that was nearly falling apart. Our little journey to the meeting was still over 24 hours away, so I took the time to learn more about Mr. Dinero. There was something about the way he talked that somehow made it seem like he had never set foot in the wasteland. When I asked him about where his job as a chief ambassador took him, he said that his title meant he was in charge of matters related to neighboring Phoenix. When I asked if he had gone anywhere outside Phoenix, he said that he only stepped 30 feet outside the North Scottsdale Wasteland Gate one other time. His little stroll ended when all the guards started opening fire on a glowing sand scorpion that crawled from a distant ruin. He claimed that he never had a reason to leave Scottsdale since then. I spent that second evening with my new buddy, again chatting about anything that came up. The guy clearly loved talking about himself, and talked on and on about his life of excessive luxury, a life of which I couldn't relate. He surprisingly brought up Tucson and how he heard mention of someone matching my description down there. I again told the story that my heroic deed there was highly inflated. All he said was that I was just being humble like so many other Tucson residents. When I confirmed my southern reputation, he said he felt safer about going into the wastes with a gun-slinging southern Arizona pistolero. We talked about anything, and Mr. Kekos joined us on the couches while the 7 girlfriends lounged upon all of us wearing essentially nothing. It was there that I asked a lot of questions about Scottsdale and Mr. De Niro's position. Whenever Mr. De Niro got distracted tonguing one of the girlfriends, Mr. Kekos picked up where his boss left off, clearly used to that type of behavior. My big questions were about Scottsdale and how it became so successful when Squattertown Phoenix was right next door. The answers were a little less complicated than I initially suspected. Phoenix and Scottsdale both grew from their domination over the valley's Colorado Reservoir and grew as one for a long time. However, approximately 80 years ago, some unknown vault outside of Scottsdale opened up, and its occupants set out seeking shelter from whatever post-war societies emerged. Scottsdale was the nicer part of the valley even before the bombs fell. So when the vault's occupants settled the growing post-war city of Phoenix, they naturally preferred the more aesthetically pleasing ruins of Scottsdale. Who the vault originally housed was lost in time, but they had a lot of technology and very bright people. It wasn't long before the former vault residents took over the Scottsdale area entirely and started constructing the gates and walls. Once the gates were done, a Scottsdale resident developed the radiation posts that surround Phoenix and sold them to their neighbors. The man who got rich off the first rad posts poured his gains into Scottsdale's reconstruction, declared Scottsdale separate from Phoenix, and laid the groundwork for the present town's elitist policies as its first mayor. Scottsdale wasn't isolationist, but differed from Phoenix in its selective mindset. The city only accepted new residents based on a certain list of qualifications, but the qualifications for entry and citizenship into Scottsdale were proof of affluence, proof a person has money, demonstrates an unparalleled level of class beyond that of a wastelander. In other words, proof you can dress and talk all fancy like, possess values or skills to benefit the Scottsdale community, or have actual usable skills. Complete the civil socialization and intelligence aptitude test. Take a test that proves you're gentlemanly and smart. Those criteria didn't apply to people born to Scottsdale parents, but outsiders passing all those qualifications could be negated if an entry officer, or city elite like Mr. De Niro, Mr. Kekos, or over 150 other esteemed Scottsdale residents deem someone as too ugly and/or unbecoming of a socialite. As beautiful and successful as Scottsdale was, it was the most superficial and pompous community likely in the entire world. If I had to guess, I assumed 99.999% of Phoenix residents, and even myself, wouldn't be able to set foot in Scottsdale in their entire lifetime. However, I was obviously a very special case. So, when I learned the basic history of Scottsdale, chatting with Mr. De Niro about his personal life got me talking about the wastes and my life living off the land. I went on about myself until it became clear that my new buddy wasn't listening at all. Even Mr. Kekos felt uncomfortable hearing about all the filth beyond the Scottsdale gate and got up to focus on literally anything else. It was then that I asked Mr. De Niro again why he would want to be involved in Legion affairs. I still didn't know much about the Legion, but if they were anything at all like a typical tribe, raider gang, or prepper community, then that was a far stretch from his spoiled lifestyle and the beautiful penthouse. Mr. De Niro was more focused on the women beginning to undress him to really answer my question. So I quickly went to my room before seeing where that led. Lying in bed, I still wondered why Mr. De Niro would admire the Legion, and remembered that first conversation about his connection to the mysterious Joshua. I tried to think what he was talking to Joshua about, and how he got the idea that the Legion could take his home city. Thinking about what Mr. De Niro saw in the Legion made me wonder about the reverse end. What on earth did the Legion want with a sex-crazed man in his late teens with too much power and zero wasteland experience? I only saw the Legion up in Sedona briefly, but I was too busy killing them with the Resistance to fully understand who they were. Everything I heard about them, what little I heard about them, detailed slavery, murder, rape, torture, war, and assimilation, all of which were things I assumed an entitled and sheltered rich boy would detest. Then my thoughts went in another circle. Influential socialite or not, what does a slaving, murdering, raping, torturing, assimilating war tribe want with that man who embodied everything they weren't? I didn't know what to expect the next evening, and still had no first-hand accounts to accurately base the whole situation on. So, while trying to explain away my curiosity and plan my escape back to the wildlife preserve, I fell asleep. The next morning we were preparing to leave for the gas station I marked on my map. Mark De Niro had all his servants bring him his survival gear and he put on his crazy wasteland suit. A guard then came out of the elevator and gave me my shotgun back. At noon, we were ready to leave. After Mark De Niro kissed all 7 of his girlfriends goodbye, we went down the elevator and into the streets of Scottsdale. As I took in the surroundings again, a large Pona was escorted to us by another servant. The beast was amazing and far cleaner than the one I went to Sedona on. This Pona was very muscular, dark brown, with very little radiation decay, and its eyes emitted a glowing blue light. Mark mounted the beast, helped me onto the back, and we trotted down the main avenue towards the North Scottsdale Wasteland Gate. Mark stopped before the thick steel gates and gave one of the black and gold sentries an OK sign. There was an echoing crash, and the giant doors creaked open from the center. Clearly, the North Gate hadn't been open in a while. The howl from the steel doors and grinding gears eventually died, and the ruins of North Scottsdale stood before us half buried by sand and neglect. Just as the sun was starting to set, we rode north, followed by the echoing noise of those gates closing. Chapter 19. Not Who I Said I Am. As we rode on into the fringe of ruined Scottsdale and took in the sea of rubble, a strange thought hit me. Where were all the people? The outskirts of Phoenix had giant markets, tent encampments, and ranches for miles beyond the gate, but not Scottsdale. Scottsdale was completely dead directly outside the northern walls without a single person in sight. Despite sharing a western border with the packed squatter town of Phoenix, the Scottsdale wall stood alone facing the north, proud and isolated. With that, I continued to hold on to Mark as we strode on into the no man's land north of civilization. The sky got very dark as we finally approached the old gas station just off the western highway to Flagstaff. We got lost for a while navigating the ruins and successfully avoided the roaming packs of feral ghouls, irradiated creatures, and heavily armed raider patrols. We were alone on the crumbling highway with not a caravan, raider, or monster to be seen. Up in the distance, we saw the dark silhouette of the old gas station marked on my map. As we approached, the wind began to blow harder, but the wastes were dead silent. Under the giant gas station awning, I saw the shadow of a lone man who I assumed was the strange courier named Josh or Joshua. Mark and I dismounted from the beast and approached. As we got closer, Joshua took a few steps forward, allowing the stars and full moon to expose him to the both of us. Joshua stood tall beneath the awning in a dark crimson tunic, large black fur-fringed combat boots, and a golden bull figure above his right pec mounted on dull steel pauldrons. Mark De Niro was right. Joshua clearly had some sort of Legion affiliation if his outfit was any sort of indication. We stood only feet away from the man as his face remained stern and expressionless before saying, "Who is this man you brought? I told you to come alone, did I not?" Somewhat taken aback by his authoritative tone, I recalled his relatively calm demeanor from days prior and responded, "This is Marcus De Niro, Chief Ambassador of Scottsdale. He said you two had business together." Joshua gave a slight grin, illuminated by the moon. "So, you found your way into Scottsdale like I suggested?" "Good." Looking at Mark, Joshua continued, "I wasn't exactly expecting him to show up with you, but is there anyone else I should be worried about?" Briefly looking around the night-shrouded desert, I said dumbly, "Nope, just brought him." Staring at me with a menacing gaze, Joshua said, "I assume so. I know we didn't mutually agree to this, but I hope you don't mind that I brought some of my own people." He held up 2 fingers, and over a dozen shadowy figures came out of the night, dressed in dark crimson and heavy steel armor, carrying large weapons. The men encircled us, then stopped, and silently watched our every move through their goggles and face masks. With all the heavily armed Legion soldiers surrounding us with automatic guns and sharpened blades at the ready, I asked with a shake in my voice, "Are you going to kill us?" He looked at Mark for a brief second and then said to me, "God forbid I should do any such thing. My guard here is to ensure our safety. The open desert is a dangerous place after all." The Crimson Guard stood motionless and dead silent. I felt their eyes, and my mind begged for some kind of explanation for all of this. My mind couldn't even consider how Mr. De Niro was feeling or what he was expecting in those moments. Voice still shaking, I managed to utter, "So, what do you want?" Joshua had a stern expression and eyes that looked straight into my soul. He said, "I know of you, Drifter. I really do. From dealing with the raider menace down in Tucson to living off the land in a secluded shack, conflicting with the preppers at Agua Caliente, and helping to butcher over 30 of my legionaries in Sedona. You make your mark wherever you go." He paused for a moment and focused on me intently. "Like your friends in Mr. Swilling's resistance, I too have eyes everywhere." I asked, "So, you want revenge from me for what they did to your men in Sedona?" Looking at Mark, who still stood nervously and hadn't made a single noise, Joshua said, "Give me your weapons. Toss them to the ground." I stupidly asked, "Why?" All the crimson, steel-clad, and faceless soldiers broke the desert silence by a uniform crackle as they racked their weapons and aimed them at Mark and I. With nearly 20 guns pointed straight at our heads, Joshua said calmly, "This will go better for you if you do what I ask." Arms vibrating, I slung the shotgun off my shoulder and tossed it to the ground. Mark withdrew his engraved revolver and did the same. My mind couldn't handle any more of the mystery or suspense despite how terrified I was. So I flat out asked, "What do you want from me?" "I did help kill your men, so if you want to hurt me or whatever, you should just do it." As soon as the last syllable left my lips, Joshua immediately responded, "I don't want your blood or any sort of retribution for the incident you partook in. In fact, I want the contrary. I would like to thank you for assisting me at Hallow Wicks and present you with the opportunity of a lifetime. I want you as an ally of the Legion." I was almost in disbelief by what Joshua said and honestly caught off guard. I fumbled for words for a moment before realizing how powerful this guy was. "So I guess you aren't just a mailman. I knew you were something else from the moment I cut you down from those gallows." I paused and asked simply as I could, "Who exactly are you?" He stood tall but only moved to clasp his hands behind his back. The way he puffed his chest out made my eyes focus more on the golden bull on his chest. He said, "I am Legatus Joshua Graham, commander of all of Caesar's armies in the field." He stopped himself before tying our first conversation into the present. "I want your help in bringing Arizona under one banner." Mind still swarming with thoughts and feelings, I muttered, "Wasteland unification, right?" I knew he heard the words by the slight grin that grew on his face. He ignored the sarcastic muttering and I asked directly, "I don't understand. Why me?" Joshua's eyes caught mine, and even though we were the same height, his posture made him appear as though he towered over me. "Because you have made a habit of defying your mortality. You leave your mark wherever you go, whether you intend to or not. Yes, I know that you didn't intend to be idolized by killing El Tiro de Muerte, but that doesn't matter. You are an icon in southern Arizona, and most importantly, a trusted friend of Jack Swilling's resistance." I interrupted his explanation, and all the stories I heard about the Legion hit me at once. Joshua, or Legatus whatever, was just explaining how his group could use me for their own ends. I almost completely disregarded the guns pointed at my head and said defiantly, "So you want me to betray my friends in the resistance to be one of this Caesar guy's servants? That's how you want to thank me for helping you? A life of slavery or whatever?" He didn't seem fazed at all by my outburst. Instead, his face remained the same as he looked past me at the faint glowing lights of Phoenix and Scottsdale far to the south. I frustratedly awaited an answer and saw Mark still standing nervous and silent. Joshua ended the pause by saying monotonously, "Phoenix will fall. That is simply what is going to happen whether the resistance interferes with our marches or not. Your friend Mr. De Niro here understands that. It became quite clear that he is on our side given the correspondence I oversaw." All I ask now is that you see what is coming for Phoenix." I said instantly, "What if I want to go back to Phoenix?" He sternly said, "I will not stop you. Once we are done here, you can either accompany me to Caesar with Mr. Dinero, or you can walk back to Phoenix at the mercy of the wasteland. You will be unharmed by my men here, but when the Legion inevitably takes Phoenix, you will die there in the streets or on a cross. I leave the choice to you. Do you want to win or be erased from history?" Joshua saw the bewilderment on my face and graciously motioned for me to step back and think it over. I sat on a nearby rock to consider all that happened to me in only a couple of short weeks, while Joshua spoke to Mark Dinero in private. My mind raced about what to do. I couldn't betray the resistance. I had obligations to them. But then I thought, do I though? They saved me from getting hanged for being the spy I wasn't, and I did agree to join their movement. It was in those moments of self-reflection that I remembered my plans to escape the entire world again. Joshua just showed me the exit, but I wondered what he meant exactly. He said that when the Legion inevitably takes Phoenix, I'd die on a cross or in the street. But what if I wasn't in Phoenix? I wanted to escape everyone and everything, and just live the rest of my days in my shack. I was involved in things I wanted zero part in. Looking at the Legion guys who focused their guns on me, I remembered the effect of not taking any action from all those years ago, and how it all led to where I currently sat. All of northern Arizona was under Legion control, and I finally concluded, given everything I stumbled into, it couldn't hurt to at least see what Caesar had to offer. So I got up, approached Joshua Graham, and asked, "What will happen when we ride to Caesar?" A very small and barely noticeable grin appeared and disappeared from his face before he said, "Once we arrive in Flagstaff, you and Mr. Dinero will be taken to Caesar directly. Considering your connection with the Resistance, he will likely appoint you to the Frumentarii after undertaking a task. Before you perform the task, you will be granted some sort of training and equipment." I quickly asked, "What are Frumentarii?" Joshua said, "Frumentarii are soldiers of the Legion who specialize in infiltration, assassinations, intelligence gathering, and whatever our Lord or I require. There won't be time to train you on everything the Frumentarii do, given the recent events, but you will learn what is necessary." He paused, noticed my eased expression, and said, "I'm glad you agreed to my offer. You will not regret helping us." I said plainly, "I hope so," then asked, "Can I get my gun back?" Joshua the legate took that as his cue to rally the stone legionaries around us, and one of them came out of the darkness leading his own Pona. As Joshua mounted up and handed over Mark and I's guns to one of the soldiers, he said, "I cannot do that, I'm afraid. In Caesar's territory, no one other than his legionaries are allowed to have weapons of any kind. Once Caesar meets you and you swear loyalty, you will be granted access to your weapons." I'd never truly gone into the wastes without some kind of weapon, so I felt naked despite the 20 heavily armored soldiers around us. Joshua saw our hesitation and said somewhat boastfully, "Don't worry, Legion lands are the safest in the wasteland." With that, I jumped on the back of Mark's steed and rode alongside Joshua while his men marched on foot behind us. I looked off the road and saw a sign that said, "Flagstaff 105 miles. Chapter 20, The New Rome. We marched on for hours until evening became dawn. Mark was surprisingly quiet considering his personality during this time. The whole party only made camp once, where I got to sleep for a couple of hours before we marched on to the Legion outpost at Camp Verde. The run to Camp Verde took another few hours, so I managed to get a couple of questions answered. Mark remained unusually quiet, but Joshua led the way north, and I managed to learn what the two of them were talking about. Some of it was stuff I had no knowledge of, but made sense to Mark. Basically, Mark concluded what he initially told me, but with some new details. The Legion had been fighting up north long before I even set foot in Arizona, and was primarily a northern concern. After the Legion took Flagstaff in 2256, they had been getting the occasional engagement by Swilling's resistance, and managed to trace their agents back to the valley. Several months back, Mr. Dinero happened by a new face in Scottsdale and hit it off with the guy. After some talk and even drinks back at his penthouse, the stranger pulled a gun on Mark, accusing his father of funding the resistance. The stranger's plan was to ransom Mark's life in exchange for information on Swilling's resistance. The stranger clearly didn't find the right guy. Mark's father had been out on one of his last whoring binges when the stranger pulled his gun, so they had to wait a while. As they waited for Mark's father to return, the stranger explained his plan, only to be met with a laugh from Mark. It soon became very clear to the stranger that Mark's overly spoiled family wouldn't want anything to do with the organization that panders to the squatters of Phoenix. Mark talked his way out of a hostage situation by hating Phoenix more than the guy aiming the gun at him. So eventually the gun was lowered, and the two talked the night away until the Legion came up. Turns out, the stranger was sent to Scottsdale by bad info, and though there was an embarrassing mix-up, the stranger realized who Mark was and his potential use. Not surprisingly, the stranger was a Legion agent and offered to set up a communication with his boss known as Joshua. Mark's father died only a few weeks later, and the teenager inherited his title. Although Mark never saw the stranger again, he left an introductory letter to this supposed Joshua at their designated drop box. He forgot about it for a while, but eventually received a cryptic response. So Mark had been exchanging letters with Joshua for several months until he received the last one approximately 4 days earlier. In the dead of night, Mark saw the last letter that described me in great detail, said to monitor incoming scaver traffic from the Phoenix ruins, and ordered Mark to ensure that I made it to my meeting with Joshua in 3 days. Mark was initially supposed to simply make sure that I made it to the meeting spot safely, but took it in a different direction. Mark had his right-hand man take me into Scottsdale, where he held me captive until the meeting. Then, Mark decided he was tired of talking through paper and stole the opportunity to meet the mysterious Joshua alongside me during our initial introduction. During our nighttime chat at the gas station, Joshua told Mr. Dinero to come to Flagstaff regardless of if I agreed to accompany them for potential assignments from Caesar himself. So, we rode on through the North Wastes, and before reaching the outpost at Camp Verde, a group of Legion riders joined our rank. The guards following on foot then went their separate way while we rode on with the mounted legionaries. Through the burnt trees and bright rocks of the northern terrain, I saw crimson patrols marching the woodlands. Along the roads we would pass by patrols of 10 legionaries, all wearing crimson, carrying spears, machetes, or various small arms. Each patrol was led by a heavily armored steel and crimson-clad man, with a helmet that sprouted red and black feathers horizontally across the top. I briefly wondered why every single Legion man I saw was wearing goggles, some sort of face mask, and a helmet. I wondered if there was a reason they all completely hid their faces. Seeing these faceless soldiers in red roaming the region made me reflect back to my last trip up north. The Resistance and I cut through the deep woodlands and beyond any patrol path, so I didn't get to see the people we were there to kill until I had them in my sights. The deeper north we went, the more frequent the patrols became. Still not seeing too many non-soldiers, I remembered we were still on the fringe of Legion territory. Riding with the other mounted escort allowed us to go much faster than with the footbound soldiers in the beginning. About 2 more hours of fast riding went by after we passed the encampment at Sedona, where I saw the site of the massacre only a couple weeks before. Everything went on business as usual for them, except there were more sentries standing around the hall. It was almost as if we hadn't done anything to them as legionaries unburdened by heavy armor went in and out of the place. In Sedona, I noticed everyone there was either dressed like one of the legionaries or wore torn-up old rag outfits with large red X's on the chest and backs. I thought back to the stories about how the Legion enslaved people, but I didn't think anyone not in crimson and steel was a slave. After a couple of hours more, Sedona was behind us, and we reached the outskirts of Flagstaff. The city wasn't in very bad shape. I guess it wasn't hit very hard in the blast. The suburbs were ruined but still speckled with patrols of men in standard legionary apparel. We followed the wide and decaying road under a highway overpass and into the heart of town, where the ominous gate to the Legion capital stood proud in the distance. I wasn't sure if it was me or not, but it seemed like the sky suddenly went from bright and sunny to overcast and gray. On the outskirts lining the road to the gate were wooden crosses made of old telephone poles or scrap wood jutting up from the earth. Half of them had the moaning bodies of slaves nailed to them, and the occasional man dressed in a crimson tunic. There were vultures feeding on some of the bodies, and I heard the groaning of those poor souls dying of thirst, hunger, or blood loss. The Legion capital itself was surrounded by a giant junk wall covered in barbed wire, reinforced with cars and concrete slabs of ruined buildings. The wall itself reminded me of the Phoenix Wall, but this one had Legion banners all along it spattered in dry and wet blood. Reaching the gates, there were slave pens packed to the wire with poor tribals who were mostly women. Large wooden log buildings dotted the area before the gate in rows, covered in legion banners, and soldiers roamed in and out. Unlike the diverse crowds of traders, ranchers, caravanners, and countless others in Outer Phoenix, Outer Flagstaff held a more sinister atmosphere. Legionaries in steel, red, and blood-stained tunics drilled or dealt with slaves. Where Outer Phoenix bustled with commerce and people living their lives, Outer Flagstaff bustled with slavery and almost an entire populace preparing for the next war. As I took in the surroundings, it wasn't long before we stopped at the giant gates to Flagstaff proper. Soldiers on the flanking wooden towers made a gesture with their arms, and the thick steel gates creaked open. On the other side, all the sentries saw who stood before them and dropped to their knees, putting their right arms over their heart. Joshua Graham waved them off and they stood up to resume their duties. Inside the Capitol, I was utterly amazed. The streets were paved in stone much like Scottsdale, but instead of asphalt, the roads were lined with smooth-cut rocks. I had never seen anything like it before, but after taking in the architecture, I saw the people. In place of paid, clean, and polite servants from Scottsdale, there were worn-down and miserable-looking slaves being abused by their legion masters. I expected Flagstaff to be an anarchy based on stories I heard and my own assumptions. But despite the rampant slave abuse, people filled the streets much like Phoenix. On our trot through the stone streets, I even noticed a few dozen traders leading Brahmin to the bazaar, getting escorted by legionaries or their own roughneck guards. Even though there were traders and other people in the city, I strangely found the whole demographic more interesting than scary or disgusting. I began wondering how a city smaller than Phoenix, but larger than some out west, could function almost entirely of either slaves or soldiers. We rode on slowly through the streets, passing crowds of slaves led by soldiers, and large columns of legionaries marching to distant battlefields. Slaves lined scaffolding and platforms in the distance, constructing monuments to Caesar or wooden scrap housing for the soldiers. We passed large red tents on street corners with crosses facing the main roads, and alleyways full of farming plots where slaves tended to crops or Brahmin. The slaves worked, and the legionaries either supervised them or trained in one form or another. Finally, we reached an open square in the center of town where over 100 legionaries stood silently in formation, while an abnormally large man dressed in heavy metal armor barked orders at them. The armored man in charge had a long red cape draping to the ground around his blood-spattered shin guards, a steel helmet sprouting red feathers horizontally in a large plume across the top, and a face that radiated unmistakable loyalty, determination, and ferocity. As we rode between the formations, the armored man thundered a gibberish-sounding command, and the legionaries simultaneously dropped to their knees, doing their salute to the legate. Joshua waved at the armored man and said, "Ave Centurion, true to Caesar." The centurion bowed and stood up, signaling the rest of his men to do the same. We approached the large brick building in front, where I noted a faded sign that once said Flagstaff City Hall underneath a freshly painted red sign that said Palati Caesaris.